going to talk today about biosimilars, something that ACE has been a thought leader on since 2009 when they first entered the Canadian market. And in the, arthritis, they've been used in arthritis since 2014. 52 biosimilars are currently approved by Health Canada for chronic diseases, not just inflammatory arthritis, but cancer and inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes, and psoriasis. And across the ocean in the European Union, they approved their first biosimilar in 2006. And they have approved, the EU has approved more than 88 biosimilars. Rheumatologists in Canada have been regularly prescribing biosimilars for newly initiated or new start IA patients. But biosimilars have been in the news over the last 3 years, in particular because provincial and territorial drug plans have begun to introduce or implement biosimilar transition policy, where in full consultation with their patients, prescribers, rheumatologists are now transitioning their patients from an originator biologic to its biosimilar. To speak about this new environment and the expanding use of biosimilars across Canada, we're joined today by Dr. Jane Purvis, who is a leading rheumatologist in Canada and researcher based in Ontario, a leader in the Ontario Rheumatology Association, and an expert on biosimilars. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Purvis.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to come.
In 2023, Ontario and Newfoundland and Labrador, Dr. Purvis, have joined 7 other provinces and territories, including British Columbia and Alberta and Quebec, and have announced biosimilar transition policy. If we just look as in Ontario as an example, what is the government proposing or implementing as new policy?
That's a great question. What are they doing? What the Ontario government has announced is a plan to transition all patients who are on biosimilars or initiator biologics to biosimilars of the drugs that they've selected. So they're in the rheumatology sphere, have selected Enbrel, Humira, Remicade, and Rituxan, and the patients who are on those medications paid for by the government starting on March 31st, are going to be asked to transition to a biosimilar of those products, with the process being completed by December 29th of 2023. So we have basically 9 months to get everybody switched. And this will also include people who are getting the drugs paid for by the government for psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease. Some of the drugs available are also for multiple sclerosis, diabetes. So a whole bunch of people switching, including a large number of rheumatology patients.
In some of the provinces, you mentioned Ontario, patients are going to have 9 months to transition from originator to biosimilar. In other provinces, it's been 12 months. So it really depends on each individual drug plan and what they decide how long is necessary to have the transition, over what time period for it to occur. One thing that is consistent and common among the provinces is they talk about how biosimilars will be able to save them money. And as an example, in Ontario, the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board estimates that Ontario could save more than $200 million annually with the implementation of its biosimilar transition policy. The Minister of Health, Sylvia Jones in Ontario, said that patients will continue receiving the same high quality treatment while allowing the government to fund more new drug therapies, bring innovation to the healthcare system, and continue its work to deliver better connected patient care. To get behind the the logic and to understand better how biosimilars can produce that, maybe the next question, Dr. Purvis, is for our audience, what is a biosimilar biologic and how can it produce or present these benefits for public and private drug plans?
Another excellent question. So a biosimilar by its name is a biological substance that is extremely similar to something else. So if we consider the originator or innovator molecule being, let's say, Enbrel, which has been on the market since 2000, it had patent exclusivity so that it was the only version of itself allowed. But when it lost its patent, other companies decided to create very similar versions of the same molecule. Because these are large, complex proteins that have to be grown in living cells, you can't make an exact copy like you could a generic small molecule like aspirin. But the molecules that have been created have been studied and have found to be biosimilar in the sense that they work exactly the same, they have the same adverse events, they're administered in the same way, they're not less effective, but they're also not more effective than the innovator molecule that they can replace. The reason that they're less expensive is that the companies don't have to go through the $1 billion primary investigation for the products. And that's also why these companies get to have exclusivity and don't have any competition for a while so that they can hopefully make back some of the money they spent making the product. But these new ones are brought to market using technology and relying on the research, much of the research that's been done in the past. They only need to show that they are essentially working the same as the innovator and then come to the market at a slightly lower price.
I think you make some excellent points there, and certainly it's important for our audience to understand that these are really complex, big molecule medications, whether it's an originator or biosimilar. And as biologics, they can be very expensive and, as you say, time consuming to develop. This can limit patients' access to these medicines and make it difficult for publicly funded drug plans, as an example, to afford them. Some of the data that we have from the Canadian Institute of Health Information tells us that the public drug program spending on these biologic medicines reached $4.4 billion in 2021. That's almost 30% of total public drug plan spending. And for the 10th consecutive year, anti-TNF biologic medicines used for inflammatory arthritis like rheumatoid arthritis or Crohn's disease accounted for the highest proportion of that public drug spending total. So governments are addressing that cost pressure by adopting and expanding the use of these biosimilars. And I think it's important, as you said, for people to understand if Health Canada has approved them, they are very, very similar to the originator. They're safe and effective. And our hope is that these drug plans will reinvest those savings back into the system, but in particular for arthritis patients, making it more accessible to new drugs and addressing models of care gaps in those provinces. Can I now turn to what does this actually mean for an inflammatory arthritis patient, Dr. Purvis? How does the transition work?
Well, that's another good question. So in Ontario, the way it's happening is that prescribers have already received a list from the government of their patients who, according to the government's list, are appropriate patients to be switched. So these would be people who have approvals at the government for payment for the 4 rheumatology products that are being switched. And as of the last week, patients have started to receive letters from the government in the mail indicating that this switch is going to happen. The plan is for the patient and the prescriber to come together in Ontario, either phone, by video, or in person, to discuss switching to one of the appropriate biosimilars, because there's more than one for each innovator molecule. Currently in Ontario, most people are enrolled in a patient support program, and by switching to a biosimilar product, patient will also be enrolled in a new biosimilar program who will help them to make the transition. The plan and the hope is that it would be seamless, so there'd be no interruption, because we have 9 months to do it, and because the approvals for getting the biosimilar is much easier than the originator, because all one needs is a prescription with a special code written on it. Accessing the medication should be quite straightforward and hopefully smooth.
Patients will be required to have this new biosimilar biologic prescription before the end of the transition period. What happens if they don't?
Well, the hard reality is that the government has indicated that failure to transition by December the 29th will result in the biologic, if they're still on the innovator, that it will no longer be paid for by the provincial government. So I don't think that there's any situation where that would be appropriate. Certainly in Ontario, the Ontario Rheumatology Association 100% supports everyone switching when it's time to switch. There's no advantage in hanging on to the innovator molecules, which, though they have been around for a long time, the biosimilars have also been around for a long time and have been shown to be biologically the same. So it's certainly not worth anyone's money to pay out of their own pocket for an innovator molecule when the government will happily pay for the biosimilar for patients. There are going to be exceptions. In Ontario, they're planning to be exceptions for those who are on biologics who are currently pregnant, won't have to switch during pregnancy. People who are receiving these products at end of life care won't have to switch. And as well in Ontario, the plan is that if you try 2 different biosimilars and you have adverse events of some description, you'll be allowed to switch back to the innovator.
And that's what we've found consistently applied across Canada, is that in the provinces and territories where they have implemented biosimilar transition policy, they have recognized that there are rare medical reasons or circumstances that may require a patient to stay on their originator. And there's a process for the patient and for their doctor to ask the public drug program if they qualify for an exemption. And I think we should underline that in the 7 provinces that have implemented policy over the last 4 years, and maybe we should name those provinces again, that's British Columbia and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia, New Brunswick and Quebec. We've seen actually very few patients actually having to require exceptional use status. So that I think is another thing that has convinced provinces and public drug plans that this is a safe and effective route to go. Dr. Purvis, you talked about, that meeting, that consultation between the patient and the rheumatologist, the patient who's transitioning. I want to talk a little bit more about the conversation and how the team around the patient can ensure a smooth transition from the originator to the biosimilar, particularly as it relates to what we have learned is a nocebo effect, essentially the opposite of a placebo effect. Maybe you can just tell our audience a little bit about that.
Right. So I guess the way to think about it is, if you're convinced that something's going to be terrible, it's more likely to be terrible. And if you're convinced that something's going to be great, more likely to be great. With biosimilars, we know that they work exactly the same as the innovator does. So if there was a difference in the ability of the medication to treat the problem, it may in fact be modified by the nocebo effect. So if someone thinks it's not going to work, or if the whole treatment team thinks it's not going to work, then the product itself may in fact work less well. Certainly in Ontario, because we've already had a chance to observe how the other provinces have gone, we as the prescribers feel confident that this switch is the right thing to do, because we all want investment in new drugs as well as these older ones. And so we're going to be doing our best to avoid feeling negative about this, but rather looking at it as an appropriate outcome after having a branded drug for this length of time, and also as a positive opportunity to put more money back into healthcare, particularly into the funding of new drugs, because there are so many new drugs coming into the inflammatory arthritis space. And we don't want to be told that because we've spent so much money on the old drugs that we're not able to add the new ones when we want them.
What we stress with our patients is to ensure that they understand that when they have their appointment with their rheumatologist, that they ensure there's enough time to discuss biosimilars and this transitioning, for them to be able to understand the concepts of both biosimilars and transitioning, and an opportunity to address any questions they have. So that point of contact, really, really important. And then of course, so is the availability of research-based information to discuss biosimilar transitioning. And at the end of this video, we will be able to include some links to the Ontario Rheumatology Association, the Canadian Rheumatology Association, as well as to a number of communications materials that Arthritis Consumer Experts has prepared. One is a website, the Biosimilars Exchange, and the other is a patient guide. And between those sources, you'll be able to find, I think, a lot of answers to any questions you may have.
The best way to approach this current transition situation is just to make sure you have all the information that you need to help you and your treatment team make the right choice for you. For all of the products that are being transitioned, there's multiple biosimilars, so it's not even just a matter of saying yes, but there's actually different biosimilars to look at. For instance, for Humira, currently in Canada, there are now 6 different options that you can pick from. So there's more than just the what does this mean in terms of switching from Humira. Then you have to decide to which other product. And it's similar, but to a slightly smaller number for the other 3 products in our area, just so that you know that you might actually speak to someone who was on Humira and is going to end up on a biosimilar to Humira, but it will be different than the one you might end up on. So there's lots of things to learn. And I would say the most important thing from the patient side is just to make sure you've got all your questions together when you see your prescriber. And, it never hurts to make a list.
Great recommendations and points of interest for patients. Dr. Purvis, thank you.